I'm salt. That means I should experience the benefits of being salt. I'm light. That means I should experience the benefits of being light. Everybody should recognize me. But the truth is, salt needs to die to do its work. Salt needs to lose itself for a greater cause in order to get its work done. And light only does its job when it's put in a place of darkness. If you take a candle outside at broad daylight, that candle's doing nothing. If you take your light into a place of brightness, you're not doing anything. But when light gets to a place of darkness, then it can do something. Go ahead and write that down. A light is only good if it's put in a place of darkness. See, one last thing here. We want to live for us, but Jesus calls us to live from us. Jesus says, I'm giving you salt, I'm giving you light, and now I want you to live from that for the world. Don't live for yourself. Live from what Jesus is giving to you for the world. Today, you are going to learn the most difficult lesson you ever will learn. But before we do that, we're going to go to 2 Corinthians and take one more look at this light passage from a different angle. Because when the Apostle Paul found out that he was the container of God's light, he reacted pretty severely to that. 2 Corinthians, it's in the Bibles we pass out, it's on page 802. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we're going to pick it up in verse 6. So go there if you would. We're going to pick it up in verse 6. The Apostle Paul says, "For God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made His light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." Next week, Pastor Reggie is going to be preaching on verses 1 through 6. He's got this passage here. But I wanted to draw out that context for us so we could see this is Paul realizing that the God who said, "Let there be light," is the same God who put His light into you and into me and into him. And Paul says that God has given me light. But check out what the next verse says. He says, "But we have this treasure, this light, in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." See, Paul is recognizing this incredible paradox. This paradox that God, the source of all light, would take His light and put it in fragile people like us. Paul calls himself a jar of clay. I mean, that's like if you take a Fabergé egg, one of these really ornate, elaborate, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars worths of decorated eggs. I think it's insane that they even have these things. But nonetheless, they're there. And people have made these things, and they're elaborate, and they're ornate, and they cost lots and lots and lots of money. And you take one of those Fabergé eggs, and you put it in a Ziploc bag. That's like what God is doing to you. He's taking his light, He's putting it into you. It's like taking the Mona Lisa and putting it in the trunk of your car. It's like feeding caviar and truffles to an infant. It's like putting a treasure in a jar made of clay. Paul says this paradox is too weird for me. And so then he begins to expand and explain how much a jar of clay he feels like, and what this light is doing in him and through him. And so as a result, we're going to learn today the most difficult lesson we ever will learn. And we're almost there. But to do it, we have to go all the way to the end of this passage and work backwards. Jump with me down to verse 16. In verse 16, Paul says this, "Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Paul says, I don't lose heart, even though outwardly I'm just a jar. Outwardly, I'm just made of mud. Outwardly, I'm wasting away. Outwardly, I'm nothing. Inwardly, I'm being renewed. Inwardly, I've got light. Inwardly, I'm a person of salt, he could say. He says, inwardly, I'm being renewed day by day. Now, you and I say things similar to this. Okay, someone might come up to you and they'd be like, hey, Jim, how's your day going? And you're like, well, I'm plugging away still. I'm making do. My marriage is kind of messed up, and my car's in the shop, and my kid is sick, but every day is a new day, so I'm still hanging in there. The next day, hey, Jim, how you doing? Or maybe this is a different Jim. Hey, Bob. Maybe it's Bob. Hey, Bob, how you doing? I'm doing okay. I'm still plugging away. You know, my iPod is messed up. My Mercedes is in the shop, and, my goldfish is sick. But every day is a new day. I'm still hanging in there. And you're like, what? And then so you talk to Steve, and you're like, hey, Steve, how you doing today? And he's like, well, I'm all right. I'm hanging in there. You know, my toenail is still messed up, and my Amazon shipment is still in the shop. Hasn't gotten here yet. And and by the way, you know, Kim Kardashian was sick on last week's episode. So, but I'm doing all right. Every day is a new day. I'm still hanging in there. We do stuff like this all the time so we can sound like we're doing all right, so we can sound like we're strong. What we do is we come up with bad things in our lives. If someone asks you how you're doing, you'll run through all the list of things that are bad before you say, oh, I'm fine. And internally what you're doing is you're saying, despite all the crud in my life, like the reality show that I like to watch being off air or having some problems, or Charlie Sheen's not coming back to 2.5 Men, and criminy, how am I going to survive now? You know, we come up with all these kinds of bad things, and then we feel good about ourselves that we're enduring them, right? We come up with all these sorts of fake bad things. Well, for the Apostle Paul, it was different. Now, I don't know what it is for you. I'm sure many of us here in this room have gone through some pretty dark times. Many of us in this room maybe are going through a dark time right now. But if you want to see what Paul was thinking when he said these words, we're going to stay in the same book, but we're going to flip a couple chapters over. Go to 11, 2 Corinthians 11. And find verse 24. Paul says, 2 Corinthians 11:24, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. That's what you and I would call flogging. That's what Jesus got right before he was crucified. 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. And, oh, by the way, when he says stoned, he meant with rocks. Okay? He meant with rocks. Just so we're clear. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak? And I don't feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? Paul is describing there what he has been through up until this point. And at this point, he still hasn't faced his final trial of being in Rome and facing Caesar and eventually being killed for his beliefs. He's not even there yet. Right now, he's just telling us about the stuff that's happened so far. 5 times he's been flogged. Once he was stoned, which, by the way, if you don't remember, is to kill people. So now, if you go back to where we just were in chapter 4, go to verse 17 and see what he says here. He says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Light and momentary? Paul, how can you say that? What's light about a bunch of rocks being hurled at your head? How can you possibly call that light? I mean, these people were skilled in the art of stoning others to death. They knew how to do it. It wasn't like Paul was their first experience on this. They would pick up the biggest rocks they could, and it wasn't about just hitting someone with a baseball pitch. It was about lugging big rocks and hurling them onto people, biggest rocks you could get, as close to the head as you could get. So Paul is being pelted with rocks in the head. He's being pelted with rocks all around his body, and he's got boulders being heaved onto him, as big as they could get, being chucked at him. Those are heavy, not light. But Paul's saying it happened to him in the past, and he's still writing. See, if you know the story, what happened is that Paul was taken out to the outskirts of the town, and they stoned him, and they thought he was dead. He was there lying on the ground, unconscious. As far as they could tell, he wasn't breathing. As far as they knew, his heart wasn't beating. They all went back into the city, and then somehow, miraculously, God woke him up. And then you know what that weirdo did? He stood up out of the pile of rocks and walked back into the city. Of course, just so you know, if anybody tries to kill you, and then leaves you for dead, and then you're really not dead, and you stand back up, when you talk to them again, they're probably going to pay attention. It's going to be a little bit different, but I don't know. But Paul stood up, and he walks back into the city. So these were heavy rocks, but apparently they weren't heavy enough to keep him down. So yeah, maybe you could say they were light, and they didn't kill him. Well, what about the flogging? Okay, that's a pretty serious issue. How can you call that momentary? Time doesn't go faster when you're going through hard times, okay? When you're being stoned, time doesn't fly. No one says time flies when you're being flogged. No one says that. It just doesn't, because when you're being flogged, every moment, every second is painful. These are like this whip with lashes on the end, and the whip lashes had little bits of stone and rock and steel and iron and glass embedded in them. And many of you saw The Passion of the Christ. You know what that was all about. Paul got that 5 times. So that means 39 lashes. Every time he got flogged, he got 39 of those lashes, and they're taking this big whip with all these like lashes at the end of it, and they're just whack, whack. Wait a minute. 39 of those. It'd take about 10 minutes. Granted, 10 minutes of torture, but 10 minutes. If that happened 5 times in his life, that's 50 minutes. Every time that happens, he would have been bloody, he would have been wounded, he would have